lot and focused on a lot, but I really want to try to maybe give a few different perspectives about how to improve cash flow in your organization. Whoops, sorry. So today we are going to look at, first of all, why is cash flow so important? I want to give you a little bit different perspective on it, possibly, and how companies tend to focus on revenue and then profit and then cash, and the relationship between those. We're going to look at the entire project life cycle and where cash flow gets affected all the way through your project life cycle. And then we're going to talk about some of the challenges that you often have with cash flow, what's causing them, and how to fix them, basically, with some new ideas and some best practices to put in place. So thank you for the great introduction. I just wanted to also emphasize that every organization is a little bit different. And what I specialize in is going into companies and really looking for how to break down small things that are happening every day that are potentially costing the company money, losing profit, or not maximizing profit that you could be earning on projects. So when I look at cash flow, when I look at profitability, you really have to look at every area of your organization. And so today I'm hoping to be able to tie back cash flow with profitability for you, because I think that's really important to look at it from a profitability standpoint. So I found this cartoon. I thought it was really funny. And it really is, while it's supposed to be sarcastic, I really do believe that it explains the way that your clients often think. They don't want to pay you. And I have a great story about that. I started my career working with A&E firms in 1989, and I worked with at the time was a smaller architecture firm in Washington, D.C. And I started doing their books. And I would sit there with Tom Toohey, who was he was the principal of the firm. You know, architects really are very, very poor at cash management in a lot of cases. As many of you know, if you're engineers and you work for architects, you know what it's like to try to get paid from them. And I would sit in Tom's office helping him with his books. And while I was sitting there, I used to go in there 2 or 3 times a month and help him. And these engineers would be calling, asking for their money. And, you know, sometimes Tom would say, just forget it, just ignore them. You know, we're not going to pay him today. Because Tom had cash flow issues he was dealing with, and he was not paying his engineers. Even sometimes I believe he probably should have been, but he wasn't. Trying to stretch his own cash out as long as he could. And sometimes when the engineers would call over and over again, I remember Tom looking at me and going, oh, damn it, just cut him a check. And so I learned a lesson back then, early on, that the squeaky wheel really does get the oil. And that, you know, there are some of those clients that you have that you just have to stay on top of them very, very frequently if you're going to ever get paid. And I just thought that was one of the formative things I learned in my early career working with A&E firms. So I want to emphasize this. This is my own quote, one of my favorite quotes that I've come up with, because I truly believe that when your clients are not paying you, and believe me, they know they're not paying you. When they're not paying you, you are financing their projects. You are the bank. And they know that. They know that they can keep your money, the money they owe you. The longer they can keep it, the less they have to borrow from their bank. And the more you're going to have to go out and borrow from your bank in order to make payroll. So it's not a good idea for an engineering firm to be a bank. None of us want to be a bank, and it's very clear that we have to have the kinds of relationships with clients that make it clear to them that we're not their bank. And we're going to talk a little bit more about that as we go along. So, you know, there's a lot of problems with having poor cash flow. It really has an incredibly negative impact on your business. First and foremost, many of you probably have a line of credit. Now, fortunately, money is fairly cheap these days. And so we can borrow money at a much lower rate than in the past, and that's very helpful when we do have to go out and borrow money, but we really don't want to be in debt. And so having to borrow money is unfortunate. It'd be great if we could all just be capitalized based on having consistent positive cash flow. But when you do have poor cash flow, when the money going out is more than the money coming in on a monthly basis, it is very hard to grow your company effectively. You can't invest in technology. It's hard to keep continuing to hire people at the rate that you want to. And it puts you in a position where if the economy does crash, and recently, you know, in the last 3 months, we've had a lot of really incredible uncertainty about the economy. And I think for the most part, probably for at least 80% of you from the hundreds of A&E CEOs I have talked to over the last 3 months, and there have literally been hundreds, 80% are very worried about the economy right now. Probably more than 80%. I think there's 20% that are saying, well, it may not be bad till next year. And 80% are worried about later this year. So it is a big concern. Cash flow is the one thing that will help you get through this level of uncertainty. Your employees have probably gotten used to bonuses over the last number of years since the economic recovery that we had from the last recession, and they're used to those bonuses, and they're used to having a level of power, I want to say, in their ability to kind of put the leverage out there of being, you know, retention for an engineering firm. No engineering firm wants turnover. You don't want people to leave. So you feel this pressure to give bonuses even when maybe profits aren't quite as high or cash flow isn't quite as good. So keep that in mind, that even though you can talk to your employees about the economy being tenuous, and for the most part, most of the firms I work with are still fairly busy and they're still living off decent backlog right now. But there is concerns about the lower number of proposals that are coming out. And so there's concern about the next 3, 6, 9 months down the road. And so when employees have this feeling like a bonus is expected, there's going to be some difficulty there in dealing with that reality as we come towards, you know, I think closer to the end of the year. Poor cash flow puts you in a difficult situation with your project managers, with your clients. I mean, it just creates this tension between them that it you know, really is uncomfortable. We know our project managers don't like asking people for money, and so especially clients that they value or have a good relationship with. So having to have those difficult conversations is putting your PMs in a more difficult position and somewhere you really don't want them to be. And you know, the other part of poor cash flow is it requires more work. You have to do collections. That takes time out of everyone's schedules. And it takes time to make the phone calls, to document the conversations. If you are doing that, hopefully you are. and to just do the work. And really, you shouldn't have to do that. If you have good clients, you shouldn't have to make those phone calls, but we all do that when we have to. So if we think about revenue, cash flow, and profit, and we're going to talk about that a little bit more, revenue is really a very primary focus of most business leaders. Many of you have not focused as much possibly on profit in terms of how you reward your employees, your division managers. Revenue has tended to be the focus, and for many of you who are on an accrual basis, revenue is your billing or your work in process. It's not cash. And there are very few firms actually that reward employees and provide bonuses based on cash. But you can't pay bonuses out of revenue. You can only pay it out of, honestly, out of cash profits. So cash profits are an important part of the metric that you really need to be looking at, especially if we are going to be going into a difficult economic situation. Cash profits are a key metric and need to be looked at just as carefully as accrual profits and revenue. So some of you run your business on a cash basis. Usually most smaller firms do. Some of you run it on an accrual basis and let your accountants, at the end of an accounting period or a year, convert that over for tax purposes. And some of you are looking at both every month on your financial statements. And that, to me, is the recommended method for evaluating the performance of your business. It's important to look at your books on an accrual basis because if you're not billing enough money every month, then that is a leading indicator that your cash flow is going to be poor. So billing is a very important thing to look at, but cash, and especially in a slow economy, is even more important. And the way that you look at it is very important. We're going to talk about the project life cycle, where money is lost throughout the project life cycle, but cash is more important in a downturn. And so I recommend you be looking at both. You should be looking at both sets of books. If your revenue on an accrual basis is much higher than your revenue on a cash basis, and that is what's happening month after month, if you have a trend of several months in a row like that, you're going to have serious cash problems, inability potentially to make payroll at some point and have to be borrowing money. And let me just also say that many firms in the last 2 months have received PPP loans from the government to keep them from having to lay off employees. And so we're kind of in this weird situation where we have this money, and but we may still have the work may still be really busy. And I've talked to many firms that are in that situation, but they're still worried about what's going to happen later in the year and how to use that PPP money. So it's very important. And I think the PPP money is great. I think it's going to save a lot of firms from facing a serious economic disaster. But it still needs to be scrutinized very carefully. Fortunately, if you get in a situation where it isn't forgiven, you are going to be able to pay it back over 5 years at 1%. So it's almost like a free loan, but you still, need to be paying attention to what's going on with it. So the metric that we normally use to measure cash flow is our days sales outstanding. That's basically a metric that shows you, on average, how long does it take to collect our accounts receivable from the time that we bill it till when it's paid. And so the metric we use is we divide our accounts receivable by our sales or our revenue. Now, I recommend you be looking at this metric by client, because you may have some clients that are paying you in 30 or 45 days, which is excellent. But you may have some that are paying you in 120 days, which is poor, very poor, and is going to be, over a longer term, is going to become a huge problem. Now, I think one of the best reports that you can use to benchmark your company's metrics against is the Deltek Clarity Report. Deltek tends to, Deltek actually partners with ACEC on the Deltek Clarity Report. But Deltek tends to survey a lot of firms and a lot of engineering firms, and they segregate the numbers, as you can see from the graph, by type of firm and size of firm, or sorry, size of firm, and they do have some metrics on type of firm. But as you can see, the average collection period for the average A&E firm is 73 days. Now, 73 days is about a month and a half, approximately, but that's usually from the time that you invoice, not when you started doing the work. And so it's really a longer period of time. If you look at it from the time that you have to make payroll until you actually get paid, is much longer. The trend has actually been pretty stable over the last number of years. You know, it was really, it got really high, it looks like, in 2011, probably because of the recession that we had back then. And I speculate if we looked earlier, it was probably higher. But, you know, over the last number of years, 8 years or so, it's been averaging in the 70-day mark. Now, I want you to think about the project life cycle. And the project life cycle gives you a lot of insight into your actual cash flow. So I want you to think about it. If you think about when you start marketing for a project or pursuing projects, all the way through the proposal process, the award process, up to the point where you start working on a project, and then from the time you start working on a project, and all that time you're making payroll with all your employees, your marketing staff, your administrative staff, your project managers who are working on these proposals, through the time where you start working on it. Then you start managing your projects, and you start at some point billing for them. And then you're waiting to get paid. From the very beginning of when you first started working on the project till when you actually get some cash in the door is quite a while. And then you have your collection process, and then you go through it all over again. So I try to put a real cash flow cycle to look at, how long is your real billing cycle, your real cash flow cycle. So let's say you work on a proposal for 14 days, and then let's say you wait to hear about whether you won it, or maybe you have interview process, shortlisting, 30 days. Now that may be quick for some of you. This may actually be 60, 90 days, but I'm going to say 30 days. And then from when you're awarded the project till you actually start the project, could be another 30 days, could be 60 days. I know a lot of projects have gotten really slowed down right now in terms of when they start. And then let's say you start the project and you work on it for 30 days before you actually start 30 days, and then you're going to create an invoice. But then it takes you 15 days to get your bills out because you have a slow billing cycle. And then we can add on that 73 days that it takes to get paid by your client. So we are now up to 192 days. That is more than 6 months. That is your true cash cycle, 6 months. You are paying your employees payroll through all this time. And then this doesn't even account for projects that start and stop, that have delays, where you have all kinds of issues, turnover with your clients that slows things down or keeps you from getting paid. This doesn't also account for clients that take longer than 73 days to pay you. It could be 90 days or 120. I was talking to a client the other day. He had $2 million over 120. Every month that you have money that is not getting paid, I believe the likelihood of getting paid on that money diminishes by about 20%. It's just a fact of life. The longer it takes to get paid, the less likely you are to get paid. So keeping it out of that over 120 bucket, even that over 90 bucket, is so important. So let's talk about some of the real challenges. And I've broken the challenges out into 3 main categories. And there's a lot of things that impact cash flow. But I try to break them out into 3 main things that you can try to do things about. So the first challenge is your clients, right? This is what we normally think about, is our clients. So number 1, they actually don't even want to pay you, right? I mean, if you think about your clients, their goal in life is to either not pay you or to take as long as possible to pay you. So if you look at every client that way, and you may have some clients that aren't like that. You may have some wonderful clients who always pay on time and believe in doing the right thing. But chances are at least 50% of your clients don't want to pay you. So if you think of every client that way, then everything you can put in place to not give them that ability is going to help. Another challenge is, and many firms have been in this boat for the last four years or more, as you are growing faster and faster and faster, you are having all these costs with hiring, onboarding, getting your employees up to speed before you can even bill them out on projects. There's a huge cost to that. So from the day one that you just decide to hire someone or actually hire someone, they are not going to be at full capacity for a while. You know, it could take 30 to 60 days to get people ramped up. And so growing quickly, you got to have a lot of cash in the bank if you want to grow quickly. I have a lot of clients that have done acquisitions in the last few years. That is a huge cash outlay. You got to have a lot of money in the bank to do acquisitions, because it can take time between the time you decide to buy a company, you start investing in the company and getting them onboarded before you're actually going to start seeing that return on investment from them. Clients want you to finance their projects, so they're looking for every way possible to delay paying you. And so the next item on this list, they scrutinize every item on your invoice. They will hold up a $50,000 fee invoice for a $200 travel reimbursement item, right? And so you've got to figure out, how do we avoid that happening? What are some things we can do to make sure that doesn't happen? Especially if you have experience with a client, you know they're going to be that way. There are a lot of things you can do in dealing with that particular client and all of those types of clients to prevent that from happening. We'll talk about some of those things in a minute. And the final thing with clients is you don't know what they want. And I see this all the time. You get a new client and don't go through the exercises necessary to really sit down with them and go through what they need and want in the billing process to ensure you get paid. And also understanding what happens to your invoice when it hits somebody's desk over at your client's office. How long does it sit on the desk? What does their approval process look like? You just don't know enough about your clients. And that is a huge challenge. And believe me, this is not at a leadership level always. This is flowing down through all your staff, your accounting staff, your project managers. Everybody needs to understand what that client wants, or you're not going to be able to give them what they want and make sure they don't have a good excuse to not pay you, because they don't want to pay you. Challenge number 2 is your billing cycle. So first of all, number 1 reason your billing cycle is cumbersome and slow is your time and expenses are cumbersome and slow. There's a whole lot of reasons. And I usually, when I get involved with clients and I'm working through their business processes with them to try to fix the major problems with the billing cycle, it goes back to project initiation. How does a project get set up, and when are those project numbers available for people to charge to? Do staff know the correct items to charge to? Is your system easy to look up and find what you're supposed to be charging to? Do you have too many things in the list from them to choose from? There are dozens and dozens and dozens of reasons why timesheets. I have a whole course in my Final Lost Dollars training course. I have a whole course just on timesheets, because timesheets are what cause a lot of problems in your business. So when you have inaccurate timesheets, that's the number 1 reason you give your client not to pay you. And they find mistakes. First of all, if they find a mistake on your invoice, they now have a permanent reason not to pay you. Well, we don't trust you anymore because you make mistakes. And so you've got to avoid that altogether. You've got to send out, pristine invoices. They're very clear and exactly what your client expects to see. Part of the problem may be your project managers or your billers or supervisors aren't approving timesheets timely enough. They're not doing them accurately enough. This is a training issue. It's an accountability issue. That causes, in both these first 2 items, they create too many corrections at the end of the month. I see firms that are spending weeks moving time around from project to project, phase to phase, and that slows things down to a crawl. You may also have too many different rate schedules and too many manual invoices, too many clients that require ridiculous billing requirements. And I get it. If you have a lot of public work, sometimes there's no way around it, but there are things you can do to make your system work better so that those manual invoices or those manual invoice formats are easier to put together. And so one of the things I often work with clients is trying to reduce that complexity. What can we do to reduce the complexity? And I find that it starts with, believe it or not, your proposal and estimating practices. Sometimes I go into firms and every single time they do an estimate, they create a whole new rate schedule. It doesn't make any sense. Why do that? You need to get down to the minimum amount of billing rate schedules you can. And then often there's just not enough urgency from your billers, your billing managers, your PMs to get your bills out fast. There's too much leeway. There's too much leeway being given, and there's not enough accountability. In the fact is, if you have most of these problems in place in your company, I guarantee your billing is taking several weeks. And if I came into your company, I could probably get your bills out in 2 days. And it's just that is an option for you, but all these problems have to be solved. And they're going to only be solved by fixing some of the things I'm going to talk about in a couple minutes, but you can solve them. These are very solvable problems. And then collections. The third challenge you have are collections. First of all, your project managers don't like talking about money. So number one, let's avoid having them have to talk about money, but there's also, they're going to have to talk about money sometimes. It's just a fact of life. Um, and there are ways of doing that that are not scary. You may have ineffective collection processes. So those are things that you can fix as well. You may not have enough leverage with your client. You know, there has to be consequences. We already established your clients don't want to pay you. They want you to be the bank. So what can you do about that? And we're going to talk about how to implement some of those consequences. You may be on a pay when paid process of getting paid from your clients. And, you know, there have to be ground rules for pay when paid. And that's a bad place to be. Pay when paid is a bad place to be. I understand why it exists. And it's usually because your architect clients get themselves into a pay when paid scenario. But you want to work with clients and especially architects. If you're a subcontractor, you want to work with clients that have good collection practices and AR practices. And then number one, you keep working with bad clients. And, you know, you could have the best relationship with a client. If they're not paying you, they're not a good client. They're a bad client. So sometimes it's a reality check. Are we continuing to work with these bad clients? And you know what? It's going to get worse. If the economy gets worse, clients are going to take longer to pay. They're going to know there's less work out there, and they're going to make it tougher for you to get paid. You need to anticipate this happening, because it is going to get worse before it gets better. So what are some good cash flow practices you can put in place to deal with these challenges? So I have 3 overarching high-level items I want to talk to you about, and then we're going to dig into these things that we just looked at, clients and billing and collections. So number 1, start managing your cash on a daily basis. When the COVID crisis hit, I know a lot of firms started doing this. This is critical. I have clients that are right now, they're doing cash. At the end of every day, they're doing a cash flow forecast. Every day. You gotta know where you are with cash. It's very, very important. So this will keep, the good thing about doing this is this will keep visibility. Visibility is very important. You wanted your PMs and everyone to know we are paying attention. This is the most important thing that we can do right now. And it really is. Number 2, eliminate, I know you guys, when the COVID thing hit, you probably grabbed your credit card statement and started looking at all your expenses. What are we spending money on? What can we cut? I know I have clients that went out and fired their marketing people, which personally I think is one of the worst things you can do. You may have to completely pivot what your marketing people are doing, but you don't want to let them go. Marketing is going to become more and more important. You want to evaluate your subscriptions. I have a client, and given they're a fairly decent sized firm, so many of you may be a lot smaller than they are. They're several hundred employees, but they just renegotiated their Microsoft contracts and eliminated $500,000 a year in unnecessary Microsoft subscriptions. You know, because over the years, as you grow and grow and grow, your subscriptions keep getting bigger. And you go back, if you do an audit, you'll find out people aren't even using half the stuff you have. You might have cell phone subscriptions. You might have, and the only reason I have Deltek on there is because a lot of you have Deltek, but they're not that easy to reduce your licenses. But it's still worth looking at. And many of you may have Adobe licenses too. I think that's another. But there's other stuff out there. I would go through the credit card and go through and have your accounting staff go look at your subscriptions. Maybe there's some ways of eliminating some of those outgoing expenses. And then another thing that many of you may not have thought about too much, but your pricing and your fees. I get involved with clients very often on creative pricing. And I often find that firms aren't charging enough. Billing rates are too low, pricing isn't done correctly, they're not upselling and cross-selling enough, and they're continuing with contract types like hourly not to exceed, which is the worst contract type you could ever have on the planet. They're not spending the time to really evaluate how they're pricing and how their fees are created and how they're managing their scope creep and extra services, because that is where a lot of your cash flow problems exist. So this is an area, I think this one alone, this is where I find a lot of lost dollars. When I'm doing my find the lost dollars analysis with companies, and we're going through and looking at 9 areas of the business and try to figure out where money is leaking and why they're not billing clients enough. This whole area is huge. Very often I have clients that we figure out ways to increase prices, fees, rates, evaluate contract types, look at scope creep and extra services, and there's a lot of money there that's being lost. So here are, on a more specific level, based on the challenges we just looked at, here are some solutions and some best practices you can start to put in place to help your cash flow with, number one, with clients. Number one, get to know your clients, especially new clients. Meet with them in the beginning. Ask them what invoices they want to see, what level of detail, what backup do they want? Do they have any special formats that they need to see? Get to know their accounting staff. Get to know their approval process. How do they approve your invoices? Who does the invoice go to? How does it get routed through their organization? Who signs off? Who decides who to pay? That's very important. You need to know all those steps at your client. Make sure your bills give your client everything they want, the level of detail. But I will also say, don't give them too much, because if you give them too much detail, you're giving them more stuff to scrutinize. So you want to give them the right amount. Charge a finance fee. Now, what I find with many firms is they have this in their contract and they don't do it. It comes from the culture trap that we look at, but that I look at. If you read my book, Find the Lost Dollars, we talk about the culture trap was keep clients happy. Well, we don't want to send them an invoice that has a finance charge because that would make them unhappy. Got to send them the finance charges. They may not pay it, but they will pay your invoice faster. Okay, so that's what a finance charge is designed to do. It's leverage. In some cases, you may need to stop work. And you should have those terms and conditions in your contracts to charge finance fees and to stop work if your AR is over 90 days. And your project managers need to know that. And ensure are no issues that they can use to deny payment to you. And that means being really careful about how you're billing people. And we'll talk about a little bit more about that in a second, but sometimes there's just little things like sometimes you have to separate your reimbursable expenses from your labor fees on your invoices because you have a client who's constantly picky about expenses, per diems, that kind of thing. Just make sure there's no issues. And then take the time to get consensus on billing. And one of the ways that I often do that is I recommend that you call a client 5 days, and especially this is clients who aren't bad about paying. Call them 5 days after you send them the invoice and say, is there anything wrong with the invoice? Do you see any problems with it? Can I expect to get paid on time? And if they know you're going to do that every month, they're more likely to pay you. Or at least they're not going to be able to come back 45 days later and say, oh, I never got the invoice, or, oh, there was this problem on the invoice. One of the things I often do is I put on the bottom of the invoice that if we don't hear from you in writing in 30 days, we're going to consider this accepted, that you've accepted this invoice as being accurate. So we want to make sure we have consensus. We don't want to give them any excuse not to pay us. So then your billing cycle. Number 1, daily timesheets. How many of you, okay, today's Wednesday, how many of you remember what you did last Friday in 15-minute increments? Any of you? No, none of you do. Your employees are making it up. If they're not doing their timesheet every day, they're making it up. And when employees make things up, it's inaccurate. It's wrong. They're going to be mistakes. They're going to charge the wrong phases and tasks, the wrong projects. They're going to have the wrong number of hours. They're going to just say, oh, I think this is what I spent 4 hours on that. They're not accurate. And the subcontractors make sure they're billing you accurately. So those are the types of things that cause problems at the end of the month and slow down the billing cycle. And then our accounting staff has to run around and chase people down, trying to get their timesheet approved on time, try to get corrections. It's just slowing everything down. Improve your project manager approval process. Probably your project managers aren't putting enough scrutiny into what they're doing. They're doing it too quickly. They're breezing through it. They're not really paying enough attention, and they're not doing it timely enough. Make sure your timesheets and expenses are completely accurate before they go to billing, to start the billing process. Because that is something that really holds things up. Minimize the number of different rate schedules that you have, because that just creates so much complexity. And then when you move time from one project to another, you have to reset the rates, and it just causes a lot of extra steps and potential mistakes as well. And then many of you are probably shaking your head going, how the heck can we do this? 2 days to get your bills out the door. If you've made that a priority in your firm, first of all, if you get your bills out in 2 days and you're cutting back from 12 days, that's 10 days faster you're going to get paid. It actually may end up being 30 days faster you're going to get paid, because you're going to get put into a different payment cycle at your client's office. So 2 days. If you made that a priority right now, you would find a lot of things you could do to improve. And then lastly, collections. Number 1, teach your project managers how the business needs to run. Teach them financial best practices. Teach them business management. Teach them how to talk about money. The reason they don't want to ask for a change order, or they don't want to ask a client to pay an invoice, is they don't know how to ask for money. They're afraid, and that's because they really do not consider themselves business people. And you really, for them to manage large sums of money every day and really do a better job at getting clients to pay, they have to be confident in their business skills and their understanding of business. And I'm going to tell you in a couple minutes how to do that. Effective collection processes. A good process will say who does it, what do they do, when do they do it, and how do they do it. For example, a good collection process should have, how do we make collection calls, how often do they happen, who makes them, and what do they say? They need a script. If you just tell people to go call a client, they have no idea what to say. Who knows what they're saying? It may not be what you want them to say. So if you have a good idea what you want people to say when they make the calls, give them a script. Create consequences for late payment, finance charges, We are going to stop work after 90 days. We're going to start bombarding you with phone calls. We're going to show up at your office. There has to be something that's going to get that client to pay you. Negotiate better terms up front. You know, if you have crappy contracts, you're going to have crappy projects. You got to have good terms. And it can't always be the client's terms. It needs to be your terms. It's always negotiable before you sign the contract. Once you've signed it, it's too late. And then finally, when all else fails and you've tried everything, get rid of your bad clients. They are costing you money. They may be costing you employee retention. And usually if a client isn't paying you, there's other underlying issues with that client. One of the things I do in our Find the Lost Dollars program is we do serious client evaluation, looking at revenue, profitability, collections, and all the other factors that go into making a good client, and a bad client, a bad client. And we get rid of the bad clients because they're bringing you down and they're making your business less profitable and less successful. And ultimately, I'm guessing if you do an analysis, you'll see that you might be actually losing money on a lot of them or breaking even. And it just isn't worth working your butt off every day to break even. So focusing on business success, it doesn't happen by itself. It requires some real effort, but the payoff can be remarkable, really, really remarkable. And I'm going to open it up for questions in just a sec, but I just wanted to let you all know that I'm starting a new case study group next month. I'm taking on a few clients, and I guarantee a massive turnaround in your business. To get your employees to think and act like an owner, to completely overhaul ineffective business practices, and to get the most out of your systems, and especially if you use Deltek, because that's what I have a lot of experience with, but pretty much any other system out there can radically make a huge difference in your collection practices, in your project management, and other things. So if you're interested in that, let me know and I'll fill you in a little bit more about how that works. So I'm going to open it up for questions and answers, and would love to hear from some of you if you have any questions. I don't see anything in the chat yet. So, you know, based on what we just talked about, what are some things that you all want to do? What are you going to do? What ideas have you gotten that you can implement right away that are going to help your cash flow? Anybody have any thoughts? Let's see. So how do you address with a client if they request special billing? Well, there are a lot of clients that request special billing. First of all, I would really try to understand in detail what it is they want and why. They may have an invoice format that they've been using for 30 years, and really yours would be just as good. It's the information that they want. So sometimes you can go back, try to understand what they want, print it out and get it out of your system. The same information, it just might look a little bit different. And sometimes if you go to them and sit down with them, they will approve that. The other thing is, if you're spending 15 hours a month doing a special invoice for a client, they should be paying you for that. That's not really overhead. That is specific project related work. because you're going and you're evaluating project costs and billings and analyzing, breaking and slicing and dicing all of the items on that are in your system and trying to get it out the way they want it. I would tell them that you need to charge them for that time. And that, having your administrative staff be billable can be very helpful in improving your profitability as well. So it really goes back. One other thing that you could consider is getting a custom invoice designed in your system. I've done this over the years with some clients where, if you have 20 projects with a state agency and they have this one invoice form that's taken you 40, 60 hours a month, maybe you should have it customized in your system. Keep in mind, though, it could break if there's an update, but I've done that in the past. I've had custom invoices designed because it was saving so much time. So those are some things you could consider. Terry asked, hourly not to exceed is the worst method. What do you consider to be the best? Well, it's interesting. If you have good project managers, lump sum is usually better. And one of the things that I do with clients very often is we go through a complete analysis of all of their projects. And I will tell you, about 80% of the firms I've worked with, when we've done this analysis, we found that time and materials were not to exceed. They were either losing money, breaking even, or their profit margin was substantially lower. One client we did this for, they're about a 120-person firm. We found that 80% of their profits came from their lump sum projects, but their lump sum projects were only 30% of their projects. And it's really important to do this kind of analysis. It really is. And the other good thing about lump sum is your clients tend to not scrutinize your invoices as much. The invoices don't take as long to get out, and they're a lot easier to submit an invoice. So again, it's a cash flow issue. Let's see, Alex said, if you have a new client, are there any recommendations on setting a payment plan, like upfront payment or installments for advance payment? I think you should be asking for it with every client, asking for money in advance, especially if you're doing some kind of weird milestone billing. I was working with a client the other day, and they do the state invoices, not in Ohio, in another state, but they had a requirement that they could only bill every 3 months. And I said, well, they should be paying in advance then. That is ridiculous. I mean, you can't make payroll for 3 months for your employees before you get paid. So at least getting a decent deposit. And then on top of that, this is even crazier. On top of that, they had retainage. They had to hold back 15% retainage or something on their invoices. So, what you find is you're going to have certain clients where everything that client does is in their own best interest and none of it is in your interest. And those are not good clients. Those are not clients that are going to help your company grow. They're going to actually hold you back and make it harder for you to hire more people, make it harder for you to grow your business, because you have these such restrictive terms and conditions that you just can't finance that type of client anymore. So personally, when I do business with a company, I always get money in advance, and I wouldn't do work with them otherwise. It doesn't make sense from a business perspective. So you might be surprised. I actually think that a lot of companies are afraid to ask. They're afraid to ask for that money. And what I do is when I give a proposal, I lay out the terms that I want, and I say, on 1/3 up front, 1/3 in 30 days, another 1/3 in 60 days, et cetera, et cetera. However, whatever those terms are that you expect, And sometimes they'll just accept them. You'd be surprised. And that goes for pricing too. You'd be really surprised at the little things you can do with pricing, with proposals, with invoicing. I'm sorry, with proposals and contracts, that clients will just accept them as, you know, those are the terms if you put them out there. So you have to get a little bit creative sometimes in how you put out there what you do and what you expect. But ultimately, the best client relationships where your clients respect you, they pay you on time, they don't try to nickel and dime, they don't scrutinize every little detail. Those are the clients you want. And the best thing you can do for your business is to keep finding more of those clients. So I hope that was really helpful. We have a couple minutes left if there's any other questions.
I'm not seeing any more questions in the group chat. So thank you so much, June. That was great information. And I'll also be sending out a recording of your presentation as well after this. But thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Holly.
And can everybody, if anybody has any specific questions, are they able to reach out to you directly through your email?
Certainly, yes. Again, if you're interested in talking to me, put that back up there. Email me at jjewel@aecbusiness.com. Happy to talk with you, answer any other questions that you have, send you a copy of my book if you're interested.
Great. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
All right.
Have a great day, everyone.
Thank you. You too.